Hi, this is Frank, and welcome back to The Next Realignment. In this episode, we're going to be talking about how, in addition to creating the new political philosophy of New Deal liberalism, the fight over Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal also created a second political philosophy, the one we call modern conservatism. Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal were broadly popular, but that doesn't mean that they were popular with everybody. There was a lot of people in America who had real problems with the New Deal, whether it was the new philosophy of New Deal liberalism or individual New Deal policies. And a lot of these people, they weren't even Republicans. I mean, the Republican Party had been pretty much shattered under Herbert Hoover. All the progressive Republicans, a lot of them had already moved over to FDR's camp. A lot of these people had started out as Democrats, as FDR supporting New Deal Democrats who, as the New Deal had played out over time, had come to believe that maybe it was a mistake. And they had become New Deal opponents. They eventually started forming alliances. Some of them disagreed on the reasons they didn't like the New Deal, but they agreed that the New Deal was a mistake. And as this alliance started to form, this New Deal opposition coalition, the arguments that everybody in it were making against the New Deal, those arguments started to become an ideology of its own. A new political ideology opposed to New Deal liberalism, one with its own ideas about how to deal with this new great debate that had emerged with the Great Depression and the crisis of legitimacy of the Republic, an ideology that we now call modern conservatism, or simply conservatism. In the last two episodes, we talked about how the New Deal had created this new political philosophy of New Deal liberalism, or liberalism. And in this episode now, we're going to talk about how those same exact events caused the creation of another new political philosophy, an ideology that had different ideas, had merged ideas that had never been combined in that way before, an ideology that had a different answer to the new great debate that the Depression had raised, what to do about this crisis in the Republic and this new economic system and the complexity of modernity. And this new ideology of conservatism eventually became the heart of a new Republican Party, where it remains there still today. Now, when we start talking about the reasons that people had problems with the New Deal and the New Deal opposition, it can be a little controversial, even today, because the New Deal and FDR, they're now considered high points in American history, and for a lot of really good reasons. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt, he's remembered as a kindly man in a wheelchair who had fireside chats and helped guide America through the horrors of the Depression, gave relief to people who desperately needed it, and then courageously led the nation to victory in the Second World War. And the New Deal, well, it's mostly remembered as the core of a lot of modern government, from really popular programs that everybody supports, like Social Security, or even a lot of sort of boring agencies that we now just take for granted as what government's supposed to do, things like the Federal Communications Commission or the SEC. And the basic idea of the New Deal, of relief efforts at a time of economic devastation, at a time where Americans were living in tented camps and relying on soup kitchens just to get enough to eat. But it's important to remember that there's also another side of the New Deal. Just like there's two sides of every political era, there was also the policies that were mistakes, the ones that we got rid of because they took the country down wrong roads or they didn't work out. There was also the abuses and the injustices that always happen whenever anyone starts trying to exercise power. There's the blunders, as well as there was a great unnecessary constitutional crisis that ripped the country apart and brought the New Deal inevitably to its end. The story of those mistakes and the pushback against them and the correctives to the New Deal that they caused, that's part of the New Deal story as well, and part of the story of America. Because politics in America and every party system is always a story of push and push back that generally leads to the place that America eventually winds up and needs to go. What were these problems that people had with the New Deal? Well, We all know that a lot of people objected to the New Deal just philosophically because it involved the federal government taking on all sorts of new powers, adding new institutions, new programs, new agencies to exercise authority it had never exercised before. In large part because a lot of people in America never believed that the federal government had or was meant to have those sorts of powers in the first place. I mean, the New Deal, it's sort of normal to us, but it's important to remember it was truly a revolution for the people at the time and for America as a whole. It involved a change in what the federal government did and what we thought it could do. And a lot of people were very concerned about that expansion of authority, whether it was just because they didn't think it was a good idea, or they just didn't think the federal government had those powers or was ever meant to have those powers in the first place. But that wasn't the only problem that people had with the New Deal. I mean, a lot of people had other problems as well. For example, real problems with some of the individual programs of the New Deal, like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, where the government was getting farmers to destroy food at a time in which Americans were literally going hungry, or encouraging larger farmers, giving all the incentives to push African American sharecroppers across the South off of their land. Or there were all the problems with the National Recovery Administration of the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NRA. Now, the problems with the NRA were probably dwarfed any program America's ever put into place. It was very controversial across America, just to start with the basic idea of organizing all of American industry into cartels, to take every industry, and they issued actually millions of pages of regulations micromanaging every industry, telling them how they had to produce their products and how they had to bring them to market and the prices that they could sell. Not only did it do that, it gave the power to make those regulations, a lot of times, to corporate interests themselves, powerful corporate leaders who then, being people, did what you would expect. Sometimes they didn't make rules for the benefit of America, but for the benefit of themselves and their own businesses and to punish their rivals. You had other problems like the private policemen who were set up by industry, and at night they would go around knocking down doors and bashing doors of businesses looking for code violations. Or the basic idea of the Blue Eagle program, where the government was handing out patriotic placards that businesses were required to display in their own businesses, like loyalty portraits that you sometimes see with dictators. And if you didn't comply, the government was stirring everybody up to boycott your business. A lot of people had real problems with the NRA, so much so that eventually the government had no choice but to set up a review board to look into all of the allegations of abuse. And they did, and they got Clarence Darrow, the respected lawyer, to head the thing. And Clarence Darrow, given his politics, FDR and the New Dealers expected that he would be sympathetic to them and their program. But Darrow, he's also a straight shooter, so he issued 3 blistering reports of all of these abuses, and it so embarrassed the president, he had to bury the review board, abolish it, and make it all just go away. Or the problem with the soak the rich tax. That was very controversial, not just because it was a high tax on the rich, but because it was designed to have a top tax rate that targeted one unpopular person in America, a person the president didn't like, John Rockefeller. And you can just imagine today what would happen if a president passed a tax bill with an 80% tax rate meant to apply just to Jeff Bezos. But above everything else, probably nothing caused as much pushback and controversy against the New Deal than when Franklin Roosevelt embarked on his famous court-packing scheme. See, when the New Dealers designed the early New Deal, particularly in the first couple years of the administration, they didn't really put a lot of thought into the constitutional justifications for what they were seeking to do. They thought there was an emergency, they were creating programs and just launching them in America. So, as you might imagine, there were going to be court challenges to a lot of these laws. And there were, and those court challenges went up on appeal, and eventually, about the middle of Roosevelt's first term, they started to reach the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in what should have surprised nobody, started striking a lot of them down as unconstitutional. Because, based on the constitutional interpretations that had ruled up to that point in history, most of them were, pretty frankly, unconstitutional. These programs gave the government new powers, powers it had never had before, and it was going to require a constitutional revolution. It was going to require new constitutional law or new constitutional provisions in order to justify the government having these new powers, something that hadn't yet happened. So when the Supreme Court looked at old precedent and they looked at these programs, they started striking a lot of them down. It all came to a head in 1935. There was one particular day in May when the court struck down several New Deal programs, but most importantly, the crown jewel of the first New Deal, the National Recovery Administration. It was a case, it was called Schechter Poultry. The Schechter brothers were Orthodox Jewish immigrants in New York. They had a poultry business, and they had run afoul of the NRA code because the code rules conflicted with Jewish law. And the government sent the Schechter brothers to prison. And the Supreme Court, in reviewing the case, struck the whole law down as unconstitutional. They said that the government didn't have the power to delegate its power to something like the NRA boards, but also that it lacked the power under the Interstate Commerce Clause to regulate commerce that wasn't actually interstate, that didn't actually cross a state line. And the decision was unanimous. So FDR, in getting this decision, apparently flew into a rage, it said. He just had been convinced at this moment that the court was now his enemy and his chief obstacle. If he was going to get his New Deal and get his plans through and have a successful presidency, he needed to do something about the court. He launched a public assault on the court, and the public was with the court. And there was huge backlash to Roosevelt. So he had to come up with a different plan. And his next plan was the court packing scheme. He would introduce a bill that gave him, as the president, the right to appoint a new justice for every justice over the age of 70 years old. And he said it was a bill to reduce the workload on older justices. But everybody understood exactly what he was doing, because the bill would have given him the right to instantly appoint 6 new Supreme Court justices, and he hoped a new instant majority that he could use to get his New Deal through. Franklin Roosevelt put his bill into Congress. Congress had to debate it. The Democrats controlled Congress, but it wasn't really clear it was going to pass. A lot of Democrats were now concerned that this was taking things too far because it was an absolute assault on the integrity of the Supreme Court and the constitutional system of the United States. The president, he controlled the presidency, he controlled Congress, and now he was trying to seize control of the last branch as well. Roosevelt's vice president, John Nance Garner, who had been up to that point loyal to him, actually left town because he wanted to distance himself from the debate over this measure. In the middle of the debate, one of the justices who had been voting against New Deal legislation announced that he was going to retire. And another justice started switching his vote and voting for New Deal cases. And the court thereby sent Roosevelt a signal that they'd be compliant, that going forward, they would give him what he wanted and uphold the New Deal cases as long as they could uphold the institutional integrity of the court. And since the bill was now unnecessary, Roosevelt was kind of forced to drop it, and he won the battle. Going forward, the Supreme Court would now give him what he wanted. They would endorse New Deal programs. They would give him his constitutional revolution. They would come up with new interpretations of the Constitution that would justify what he was trying to do in the New Deal. And eventually, they would even overrule Schechter Poultry. But that came at an enormous political cost, because now there was so much opposition within the Democratic Party between people who had up to that point been loyal to Franklin Roosevelt, but now they just felt that things had gone too far, they were out of control, and the New Deal needed to be brought to an end. A lot of Republicans were by now, they'd been progressives, so they were technically Republicans, but they were with FDR. But now you saw a lot of Democrats who had been with FDR at the beginning and been with the New Deal, and they reached out to what was left of the Republican Party, the anti-FDR Republicans, and they formed an alliance. It was a coalition in Congress that was dedicated to stopping the New Deal, and its name was the Conservative Coalition. Going forward after this, the New Deal was done. It didn't help when Franklin Roosevelt in 1938 in the midterm elections actually tried to intervene in primaries in an event that came to be called Roosevelt's Purge. He tried to get defeated the Democrats he thought had been disloyal, and most of them were reelected. So they returned to Washington very unhappy with their president, and the New Deal was now locked into place, but it would advance no farther than it had already advanced up to here. We saw now emerging a counter coalition, a coalition of people who were united in stopping the New Deal. They disagreed about plenty of things, but they agreed that the New Deal had gone as far as it needed to go and that limits needed to be put on it. Now, they had lots of different arguments that had been lodged against various New Deal programs. But all of those objections, they were loosely grouped together into two really big objections. See, the first objection was that the New Deal was somehow an assault on American liberty. And a lot of the anti-New Dealers kept using the word liberty, whether it was economic liberty, that was things like the National Recovery Act, or sometimes they'd say free enterprise, or sometimes they'd be talking about political liberty by saying the growth and power of the federal government, or whether it was actions of a FDR, which they considered to be sort of tyranny, like the court packing scheme. So this anti-New Deal coalition now started talking a lot and making all these objections in terms of defending American liberty. Now, the other idea that they relied on was this idea that there was something about the New Deal that they thought was un-American. That was the word they often used, but what they meant by that was effectively that there was something about it, the New Deal program, that was cutting against what the founders would have called Republican virtue. So Republican virtue is a phrase that we don't really use much anymore, but in the founding era and say the first 100 years of our republic, it was very, very common. Because what it meant was that there were certain traits of character, the belief was, that a democracy or a republic needed to have in citizens if it was going to survive and thrive, very different from the citizens and subjects of something like a monarchy. Because in a democracy, in a republic, the people are the government. So if the government is going to make the right decisions, and if the country is going to survive, and if the republic is going to continue on, you need the people themselves to have certain traits of character and beliefs in a way that a monarchy with subjects didn't need to have. And so what these anti-New Deal coalition was effectively saying in all of their objections was that the New Deal and the changes it was making in the government was changing something that was fundamental about America, the things and the traits of character that had always made America work, the things that had caused it to survive and thrive and to sustain the republic. And if we got away from those things, it would undercut this Republican virtue necessary to survive, and eventually the country would either fail or the republic itself would collapse. What was emerging was another new idea, a new ideology, a new philosophy of government, one that was combining ideas that had never been combined in just that way before. Just like New Deal liberalism had combined these different ideas of populism and progressivism, this different idea of conservatism, it was now combining ideas too. This idea of liberty that had always been part of American politics with this idea of Republican virtue, liberty plus virtue. The New Deal debate had unwittingly created not just one new political philosophy, but two. As FDR had pushed his New Deal programs, he had created a new idea of government, this idea of New Deal liberalism, and the reaction and the counter arguments against what FDR had done had also created a new idea of government, a new philosophy, this idea of conservatism that combined two new ideas that had never been combined that way before, liberty plus virtue. So now America had seen two new coalitions with two new ideologies emerge out of this fight over the New Deal. Two new political ideologies that had united ideas that had never been merged in that way before, each of which provided an answer to this new great debate, this crisis of the republic that had arrived with the Great Depression, this question of whether and how the American republic needed to be updated and changed to deal with a more complex economy and this new, more complex modern world. On one hand, you had this idea of New Deal liberalism that had united populism and progressivism into a new ideology that held that we needed to update the institutions of the republic with new powers and new institutions and agencies in order for us to allow expertise in policy and planning to plan progress for America for the benefit of working people and the least well off. But you also now saw a counter ideology, a response to New Deal liberalism, an ideology that also united ideas in a new way, a way that they had never been before, these ideas of liberty and virtue. And it united them into an ideology that looked at New Deal liberalism and thought it was a mistake. It said, no, what you're doing, if you do that, it's going to infringe on American liberty, and it will undercut the Republican virtue that the Republic needs to survive. And it had an alternative answer to the crisis because it said, we can do what we need to do. We can adjust to the more complex modern world without all these new powers and institutions. We can do it from the bottom up, using the institutions as they exist. And where we do need to surgically create some new powers and institutions, we need to do it with hard limits. We need to understand that any new powers that we create are not unlimited, and that if we make them unlimited, they will inevitably undercut our values of liberty and virtue. And it would start a new party system and political debate for America, because these ideologies, one would now motivate the Democratic Party, and soon the other would motivate the Republican Party, and they would carry on this great debate over decades and decades and decades to come, all the way till today. All of American politics since 1932 has been the same fight between these two ideologies, liberalism and conservatism. These two ideologies that we created and that grew out of the fight over the New Deal, which means that all of American politics since 1932 has been the same great debate, the debate that emerged out of the Great Depression and the crisis of the Republic, of whether and how we should adapt the institutions of the American Republic to the problems of modernity and the complexities of the new modern economy. That means that all of American politics since 1932, a period now running well over 3/4 of a century, all the way up till today, has at its core been just a fight over the policies of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. Thanks a lot for watching, and make sure you tune in to the next episode, because we're going to be talking more about America's great debate between liberalism and conservatism.